Zeus was many things: god of the sky, king of the Olympians, part-time philanderer. He held court on high, wielded lightning with casual cruelty, and kept up a pretty steady schedule of making mischief. Yet, like any nuanced character in history or fiction, his methods weren't always brute force and booming pronouncements. Sometimes he preferred a different kind of power play, a softer touch, a sly trick. And nowhere is this more evident than in his peculiar habit of shapeshifting, becoming not just anything, but usually something quite precise to suit his schemes. Owls, eagles, ants, even mortals occasionally. His transformations often said as much about his target as himself. Take, for instance, his time as a shower of gold. That's a tale for another day. But for now, we focus on a particular instance of his metamorphoses, one where he traded thunder for feathers, lightning for languid glides across the water. Let's rewind. Imagine yourself lying comfortably now, your thoughts beginning to drift. Let's go back way back to the days when Mount Olympus loomed not just in mythology, but in the daily rhythm of Greek storytelling. In those times, gods didn't just exist in stories. They shaped weather patterns, stirred tempers, and occasionally changed into birds. Zeus, the great sky god, king of Olympus, and part-time shapeshifter, had a reputation. You may know the highlights: lightning bolts, cloudy thrones, general thunderous authority. But today, we're going to focus on something far less grand and far more peculiar: the time he turned into a swan. Now, Greek myths rarely explain why something happens in a straightforward way. Motives are murky. Divine behavior is even murkier. But this particular transformation involved a mortal woman named Leda, a riverbank, and a perfectly unassuming day in the Greek region of Aetolia. Let's start not with Zeus but with Leda. Leda was the daughter of King Thestius and wife of King Tyndareus of Sparta. That may sound fancy, but most of Leda's historical presence is buried in variations and quiet mentions. What we do know is that she had a daily walk near the banks of the Eurotas River, a place where geese, ducks, and swans floated by in lazy circles, preening in the midday sun. Swans were seen as elegant, ethereal creatures in ancient Greece. They were associated with music, beauty, and of course, water. But one day, according to certain versions of the myth, a swan flew down from the clouds, distress shimmering in its long neck, wings ruffled, flapping awkwardly toward her. This wasn't a typical bird. Leda, seeing its frantic movements and the sound of distant thunder rolling despite the clear skies, perhaps felt a slight chill. Still, she did what any decent river-walking royal might do. She approached it gently, probably with that calm one uses to avoid startling an animal. And so began a story that would later lead to the birth of Helen of Troy. But we'll get to eggs and oaths and beauty contests later. For now, we stay in the moment. A swan in distress, a woman beside a river, and clouds gathering somewhere beyond mortal sight. Back on Olympus, Zeus was watching. And, like all great stories, this one grows not in haste but in layers, slowly, like honey dripping from a bronze bowl. Let's pause a moment here and ask, why a swan? Greek gods didn't transform willy-nilly. They were theatrical, yes, but not entirely random. Each form chosen carried a symbolic weight. Zeus had become a bull, an eagle, even a shower of gold before, but a swan. Swans were, interestingly enough, symbols of courtship. Their long necks forming heart shapes, their gliding dance on water, it all felt quite poetic. Perhaps Zeus fancied this form for its grace, or perhaps he simply wanted a quieter, softer disguise than his usual thunderous entrance. After all, it's hard to chat softly when you're crackling with electricity. And perhaps this wasn't the first time he'd tried something subtler. There are references, deep in the quieter corners of myth, of other bird-shaped visitations, lesser known and less sung by poets. But none quite matched the odd mixture of beauty, absurdity, and consequence of this moment. Meanwhile, Leda reportedly felt something beyond the natural in the swan's eyes-in awareness. A gaze too heavy for any animal. The air around her buzzed gently, like a distant storm biding its time. Still, she didn't run. Ancient stories don't explain why. Maybe she couldn't, or maybe she chose not to. Either way, it was already too late to turn away. Later, myths describe the event with varying degrees of detail and decorum. But the important thing for us wandering slowly through this mythos, the ripple it caused. Not just in Leda's life, or in Zeus's ongoing reputation for questionable disguises, but in what came after. You see, out of this strange meeting, this soft-winged deception by the river, came not one, but possibly for children. Some myths say Leda laid eggs. Yes, eggs. 2 of them, in fact. And from these eggs hatched offspring, who would reshape Greek legend entirely. Helen, Clytemnestra, Castor, and Pollux. But let's not rush to the consequences just yet. What kind of world produces myths where gods and birds and mortals and eggs share space without blinking? And what does that tell us not about gods but about people? People told these stories to explain things. Strange births, powerful women, dazzling twins. They looked to nature, saw swans floating gently, and imagined divine secrets beneath every feather. But the myth doesn't end there. It stretches, it evolves, it echoes in ways that only good myths can. Scholars have debated, historians have pondered, and armchair theologians have speculated over Zeus's reasons for choosing this particular guise. Was it a whim? A sudden fancy taken with the swan's elegant form? Did he wish to test Leda's virtue? Or was it simply a means to an end, a clever way to approach his unsuspecting target? The truth is, Greek mythology isn't known for its subtlety. Zeus's actions are rarely motivated by anything as simple as romance. His trysts with mortals are legendary, often unwanted, sometimes brutal. So why here? Why the pretense, the transformation, the wholehearted charade of a distressed bird? Perhaps it was the swan's symbolism that caught Zeus's attention, its ties to love, to poetry, to beauty. Or maybe it was the challenge, the idea of taming such a wild, untamable creature. Whatever his motive, though, he was about to make his move. As Leda stood by the river, watching the swan struggle on the bank, fate was set in motion. With a flick of his wrist and a whisper of magic, Zeus had taken his place. Now, the rest, as they say, is history. The gods had a way of inserting themselves into the lives of mortals. Sometimes it was through dreams, sometimes with a casual word tossed between 2 unsuspecting friends. But more often than not, they made their presence felt through the natural world. Storms were the obvious choice, thunderous pronouncements that shook the earth and rattled skulls. But there was also the subtler side of things, the gentle rustling of leaves that seemed to carry secret messages. The flight patterns of birds that foretold destinies, the unexpected appearance of animals that served as omens or companions. The Greeks didn't just observe nature, they engaged with it, questioned it, bargained with it. Every sunrise was a negotiation, every full moon a celebration, every fallen leaf a prophecy. In this intricate web of signs and wonders, the ancient Greeks found meaning, guidance, and sometimes divine intervention. And in this rich tapestry of nature's whispers, the story of Zeus and Leda stands out not just as a tale of seduction and deceit, but as a moment where the divine tapped into the language of the natural world in a way that was both cunning and profound. You are still resting, comfortably tucked into the warmth of a quiet room or a slow moment, while the strange logic of Greek mythology continues to unfold like a scroll. When we last left Leda, she was kneeling by a riverbank beside a swan, though not just any swan. Instead, they circle and loop like the spirals on a Corinthian column. So while one version of the myth ends with the meeting by the riverbank, most versions choose to go a step further into something much stranger. The feathers held lightning, the beak bore the weight of Olympus, and the creature's gaze concealed the intentions of Zeus himself, actual eggs, from which human or half-human children emerged. This detail was not merely symbolic in the ancient world. The Greeks had long accepted that divine unions produced strange outcomes: flying horses, armored warriors sprouting from dragon teeth, auras, in this case, royalty, emerging from eggshells. Greek mythology took such things literally, or at least semi-literally, in the way dreams are both absurd and meaningful at once. And Clytemnestra, well, her tale is tangled with vengeance, blood, and opera. But for now, let's focus not on what the children did, but on what their strange birth meant, delivered into a world that will eventually treat them as symbols of beauty, loyalty, conflict, and tragedy. But at this point in the story, they are only infants. Shell fragments still cling to their hair. The wind off the river carries the faintest thunder, as if Olympus is retreating back into the clouds. Now, myths move differently from history. They don't follow time in a straight line. They were more interested in narrative truth than anatomical detail. The Orphic tradition even imagined the entire universe being born from a cosmic egg. So when Leda laid eggs, the act was more than reproductive, it was cosmological, a symbol of the gods seeding the world with beauty, destiny, and disaster, all in one fragile shell. So if Leda, a queen, laid eggs in a palace chamber or forest grove, that was entirely plausible in the logic of myth. This may have inspired the notion of divine union as something lasting, however brief it appeared on earth. Was there gossip in Sparta's palace halls about the strange birth? And what did Tyndareus, her husband, think of it all? It favors big symbols and dramatic consequences, but tucked in the corners, we can imagine the quiet hum of ordinary life returning. Babies fed by handmaidens, eggshells swept away, perhaps stored in a temple as sacred relics. Claiming Zeus as her father elevated her status and explained her power, but it also made her a divine scapegoat for a very human war. A woman walking again by the river, glancing occasionally at the reeds, as if expecting feathers. Even if Zeus rarely practiced such loyalty himself, the image of the swan allowed mortals to imagine tenderness from a god better known for thunderbolts and imperious moods. Some said Helen and Pollux were divine. Others swapped the pairs. A few even suggested all four were born of Zeus. You're hearing a code wrapped in metaphor, designed to explain something far more complex. Why certain people mattered, why destinies unfolded as they did, and how the divine could be both majestic and absurd. The ambiguity was not a flaw, it was a feature. The myth left space for variation, depending on what point a storyteller wanted to make. Leda, we are told, soon laid 2 large eggs. Or did some early storytellers, in candlelit gatherings or marble courtyards, genuinely believe such things could happen? The idea of humans hatching from eggs wasn't particularly shocking in mythic tradition. From Leda's eggs came for children. But here's where it becomes wonderfully confusing. Some myths claim 2 of the children, Helen and Pollux, were fathered by Zeus. The other to Clytemnestra and Castor by Leda's mortal husband, King Tyndareus. This makes for one of the earliest and most complicated instances of divine paternity confusion, a hallmark of many Greek tales. Apollo was even said to ride a chariot drawn by swans during certain festivals. Their elegance, their silence, their presence on still water, they carried weight in a society deeply attuned to nature and its meanings. In short, 1 woman, 2 fathers, 4 kids, and at least 2 eggs, Castor and Pollux, often called the Dioscuri, were revered as horsemen and saviors of sailors. Their bond was so deep that when Castor died, Pollux begged Zeus to let them share immortality. Eventually, they were turned into stars, the Gemini twins, shining quietly in the night sky, still side by side. Helen, on the other hand, would go on to become the face that launched 1,000 ships, though that story comes much later. Because myth is never just story, its structure. It's the way a culture explains its fears, hopes, and puzzles. And here we have 4 offspring emerging from eggs, possibly with split divine and mortal heritage. The ancient Greeks didn't need to explain biology the way modern science does. But let's pause here and examine something often overlooked: the practicalities. What would it mean to lay an egg? Was it metaphorical, poetic way of marking children as special, touched by gods? It's easy to dismiss this detail as fanciful, but remember, the egg was a powerful symbol across the ancient world. It represented life, fertility, mystery. Let's also consider the swan again. Why would a bird be part of such a birth myth? Swans were not everyday birds in ancient Greece. They were associated with the divine, not only Zeus, but Apollo, the god of music and light. Swans mate for life. And yet one wonders, did Leda ever speak of the incident? Did she whisper it in confidence to her attendants, or carry the memory silently? Greek myth is often quiet about the inner lives of mortals. Even more curiously, we find that later Greek writers didn't tearfully agree on which children were born from which egg. This confusion had political implications, too. Helen, for example, became a symbol of beauty and catastrophe. So when you look back on this story, Zeus's transformation, Leda's reaction, the laying of eggs, you're not just hearing about gods and mortals. And yet one detail still lingers like a question at the end of a dream. Did Zeus ever visit again, not as a swan, but as himself? Did he ever check on the lives born from that strange, feathered encounter? Still with me? Good. Let's return one last time to the strange quiet at the center of this myth. We have traveled from a riverbank to a palace, from swan feathers to broken eggshells, and from an unassuming mortal queen to the emergence of children who would shape the very backbone of Greek legend. That story, Helen and her face and her 1,000 ships, is so often told, it's nearly worn smooth. But we're more interested in what came before all that. The part most stories skip over. Sparta still needed managing, and King Tyndareus, whether baffled, amused, or politely resigned, remained on the throne. Did her beauty mark her from infancy, or was it something noticed only slowly, in candlelit courtyards and whispered conversations among handmaiden. And what of the twins Castor and Pollux climbing trees, or practicing with wooden swords under the watchful eyes of Spartan tutors? There are no records of public scandal, no tablets declaring disbelief. In the world of myth, such things happened so long as they didn't interrupt the civic calendar or the temple festivals. The gods of Olympus were not parents in the modern sense. They were forces, metaphors with moods. Zeus didn't so much father children as cause them to exist. Poets, sculptors, and dramatists kept returning to it not just for its strangeness, but for its lingering questions. Was it love? Was it deception? Was it even real? His legacy wasn't a warm embrace, but a shift in history, a change in the air. He was a spark, not a shelter. The dull, forgotten bits. What did these children eat as toddlers? The swan nuzzles close, not threatening, but not quite tender either. In India, deities rode on peacocks, tigers, and mice. Why this obsession with animal bodies? Sometimes she holds an egg, sometimes two. The painters rarely agree, but always the feathers are there. Soft, white, out of place, and yet at the center of it all. Who taught them to walk or ride horses, or recite the names of their divine ancestors? But before we close the book on this peculiar tale of transformation and birth, we must ask, what happened next? And that, for one brief moment, made all the difference. And somewhere nearby, a swan floats gently on the surface, unhurried and entirely out of time. Not in the grand Trojan War sense of next. For a god who so often meddled, thundered, or flared with jealousy, Zeus showed no real interest in the children he had, quite literally, fathered. He did not raise them, visit them, or send them miniature lightning bolts on their birthdays. And for ancient people, that made them the perfect vessel for divine visits, both unsettling and sublime. His swan form vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only feathers, eggshells, and long consequences. Even into the Renaissance and beyond, artists return to this myth, painting it over and over. They tell us about how people lived with the knowledge of gods not as miracles, but as part of the weather. Zeus may have left, but Leda lived on. Her children grew. The kingdom endured. And the myth settled gently into the folds of Greek culture, like a feather falling through still air. But rarely did they focus on the children, or the consequences, or the quiet palace where Leda resumed her life. They focused on the moment still and strange where a god wore feathers and a mortal did not run away. Let's begin there. Leda, now the mother of possibly divine children, seems to have carried on with her duties. One wonders how Helen was treated. Was she loved as a daughter, or honored as a divine gift? Much later, they'd become revered protectors of sailors, appearing in the stars as Gemini. But early on, they were simply boys, sleeping side by side, learning the rhythms of the Spartan land, the smell of olives, the warmth of stone floors in midsummer, the way geese honked at dusk. And in the quiet between these details, Zeus remained absent. This is perhaps the strangest part of all. But this, too, fits. Still, myths have a way of keeping memory. In art, Leda is often shown reclining with a swan, her expression ambiguous. The myth of Leda and the swan became one of the most enduring and reinterpreted in all of classical mythology. Or was it simply a way of understanding the inexplicable why beauty and war and fate so often traveled together? Let's zoom out now. Across the ancient world, myths involving animals and transformation appear again and again. Egyptian gods took falcon form. Norse gods shape-shifted into fish and wolves, because animals move between worlds. They are familiar and mysterious. They cross borders humans cannot. The swan, in particular, became a symbol that lingered in Western art for centuries. But perhaps we should, because in the quiet aftermath of myth, the boring bits tell us more than the drama. So, in the end, why did Zeus turn into a swan? Was it elegance, disguise, symbolism? Or maybe, just maybe, it was because a swan could approach softly, without thunder, without fear. You close your eyes now, imagining a quiet riverbank. The water is still, the air is warm. You've heard of Zeus with his lightning, Hera with her vengeance, and Ares with his very loud opinions about war. Olympus, in most retellings, feels like a dysfunctional divine family reunion, filled with thunder, jealousy, curses, and arguments over golden apples. But tucked quietly in the background of this noisy mountain, there was another goddess. She didn't throw tantrums. She didn't start wars, literally and metaphorically. She didn't even leave home. Her name was Hestia. And while she may not feature in many dramatic myths, she held a role no less vital than the rest. She kept the fire burning. She chose instead to remain at home. While the other gods flitted about, causing drama or bestowing favors, Hestia sat beside the hearth, watching the fire. Hestia was the goddess of the hearth-fume, of warmth, of stillness. Even the great gods deferred to her in matters of domestic peace. But in the hum of daily life, in the rhythm of the ancient world, she was always there. When soldiers returned home, when babies were born, when marriages began, it was Hestia who bore witness, not as a judge, but as a gentle flame glowing in the background. And when Dionysus, the god of wine and festival, demanded a seat on Olympus, Hestia quietly gave up hers. She stepped aside, no protest, no fuss. She preferred the warmth of the fire to the cold marble thrones anyway. The fire that cooked food, provided light, and brought people together. The kind of goddess whose domain was so essential, so constant, that it became invisible. The father whispering a morning prayer to the household gods. She doesn't appear suddenly in a chariot drawn by eagles or lions. She simply stays. Children gathering near the fire, not just for warmth, but for stories, rituals, and the quiet presence of Hestia. The air smells of smoke and rosemary. Outside, the city bustles, the sound of something ancient that never needed to change. But here, in this quiet space, the flame has burned for years without interruption. She didn't crave statues or scandals. She didn't require elaborate temples. She existed in the ordinary olive oil lamp on a table, the crackling of kindling on a winter night, the scent of baking bread. But when Cronus swallowed all his children to prevent them from overthrowing him, yes, that happened. Hestia was the first in and the last out. A quiet honor, if you think about it, like breathing, like sleep, like the flicker of a flame that's always just there. And in every feast, every offering, every moment of rest, at the end of a hard day's labor, Hestia was present, even if unnamed. But these soft echoes suggest something deeper, that Hestia didn't need stories to be remembered. She was remembered in the warmth of every hearth and in the quiet breath before a family meal. She was the firstborn of Cronus and Rhea, which technically made her older than Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and all the rest. She never married, never went to war, and never got involved in the countless romantic entanglements that kept Olympus gossiping for centuries. It was tended carefully. It was never allowed to go out. And when new colonies were founded, they carried coals from the old fire to light the new hearth, a symbol that no matter how far the people traveled, they carried home with them. That was her power. She represented continuity, the place where the family gathered, the warmth at the center of every temple. In every Greek city, large or small, there was a sacred fire burning in Hestia's honor. Imagine that for a moment. A family in ancient Athens rising at dawn, the mother stirring lentils over a clay hearth. Her name was spoken first in every prayer and last in every sacrifice. It's easy to overlook her, this goddess who never roared or wept or transformed anyone into a tree. So why don't we hear more about her? Because she didn't demand it. Hestia was perhaps the only Olympian who seemed completely at peace with stillness. And in a culture that celebrated war heroes, dramatic lovers, and epic battles, perhaps that kind of quiet influence was simply too boring to be remembered in grand epics. But make no mistake, she was essential. A home without a hearth was not a home. A temple without a flame was not sacred. There's something beautifully steady about her mythology. She doesn't change form. She doesn't go on quests. And sometimes, staying is the most powerful act of all. Even the myths that do mention her usually do so in passing. A line here, a reference there. You might imagine her temple in the center of a busy city. No towering columns, no statues of grandeur, just a clean, circular room with a fire at the center, tended by priestesses who moved with calm precision. And if you pause, just for a moment, you can almost hear it, the low, steady crackle of continuity. Which brings us to a question most myths don't bother asking. What happens to a goddess when people stop noticing her but keep living by her values anyway? You're still with me, and Hestia is too. Always where the light is warmest, where the noise dims down and the air carries the scent of cooked grains and smoke-soaked wool. We left her sitting by the hearth, silent but central. She had no golden chariot, no beast-shaped cult statue, no dramatic temple filled with chanting oracles. But what she did have was presence. Unceasing, unshakable presence. These were not grand marble constructions. They were simple, functional buildings, sometimes no more than a room, centered on a flame that never went out. When ambassadors arrived, they were welcomed by its glow. Prisoners might be granted sanctuary if they reached the hearth in time. And above all, when a colony set sail to found a new city across the sea, it took flame from the Prytanean's hearth, carried carefully in a clay brazier, sometimes over weeks of voyage, to ensure that the goddess herself came with them. This fire was more than symbolic. It was legal, ceremonial, and profoundly practical. But it could also destroy, quickly and without mercy. Hestia was not the goddess of flame in its wildness, but of its tamed, communal form. The fire that cooked porridge, the fire that warmed a room. According to some sources, when the feasting became too loud, too raucous, too dramatic, it was Hestia who brought quiet back. Her seat by the hearth was not just symbolic, it was a grounding force. She didn't argue, she didn't advise, she simply was, the fire that marked home from wilderness. And that presence was most clearly felt in a place that wasn't here really a place, at least not in the way other temples were. The Romans, in fact, renamed her Vesta and created an entire priesthood, the Vestal Virgins, to tend her sacred flame. In the Roman Forum, the Temple of Vesta was one of the most important and enduring structures, centered on a circular hearth, It was there that the flame of the city was kept burning, watched day and night by women sworn to 30 years of silence, service, and celibacy. The temple of Hestia, such as it was, existed in every Prytanean, the civic hearth of each Greek city. When treaties were signed between cities, they were ratified beside this fire. That some of the most important things in life, warmth, safety, a shared bowl of stew, don't need drama or thunderbolts. They need consistency, a bit of wood, a spark, a hand tending the fire. So while other gods had temples of stone, Hestia had temples of habit. She lived in rhythm, not architecture. As public life shifted toward spectacle, as gods of war and revelry and philosophy took center stage, the humble flame of Hestia was gradually moved off stage. But what if Hestia was never really forgotten, just assimilated, absorbed into the background rhythms of life? Maybe that's what she always wanted. Her temples were no longer staffed, her fires no longer guarded. A single flame, flickering in an urn. The fire is tended by a priestess or a civic official, perhaps both. Or would we mistake her silence for absence? They watch over it day and night, not because it burns brightly, but because it must never go out. It is Hestia. It is the thread of civilization. Monasteries, medieval farmsteads, kitchens across the world. The sacredness of the hearth survived because it was rooted not in dogma, but in daily life. Now imagine that. Around this hearth, the new city will grow. Imagine the colony, shiprocking quietly in the Aegean, carrying not just tools, food, or soldiers, but a fire. When the settlers land, perhaps on the coast of what we now call Italy, or in a sheltered harbor of North Africa, they build their first structure, not as a house or a market, but as a hearth. It's easy to forget that in the ancient world, fire was both miracle and threat. It provided light, safety, and nourishment. And though most Olympian myths are filled with movement, chariots, journeys, feasts, wars, Hestia's gift was stillness. Even among the gods, she was a calming presence. But, as the centuries passed, something curious happened. Worship of Hestia began to fade, not abruptly, but like embers cooling in the early hours of morning. And yet her presence never truly vanished. Because while people stopped praying to her, they didn't stop practicing what she stood for. Even in late antiquity, Roman homes still began meals with a quiet acknowledgement of the household fire. For the Romans, as for the Greeks, the hearth wasn't tea, just a place to cook. It was the soul of the home and the axis of the world. And long after the fall of Rome, the quiet values Hestia embodied hospitality, continuity, shared meals, lived on in places that had forgotten her name. And that's the most remarkable part. Because Hestia teaches us something that very few Olympians do. That power doesn't always have to shout. That sacredness can exist in the ordinary. Which brings us to another curiosity. We often speak of myths as forgotten when they're no longer told aloud. After all, not every god needs worship. Some are content to be lived. And yet, I can't help but wonder. If Hestia were to walk among us, today quiet, composed, apron-tied and hearths glowing wood, we recognize her. You're still here, and so is Hestia. In truth, she never left, not really. In the background of history's grandest moments, her flame flickers steadily, never demanding attention, but always present, quiet, constant, essential. We've seen Hestia, renamed Vesta, transform from a domestic goddess into the center of state religion, all without changing her essence. She remained the flame, the hearth, the embodiment of home, no matter where home shifted to. We've traveled from the sacred hearths of Greek cities to the solemn rituals of Rome. What happened to the idea of Hestia after the fall of empires? But now, as we close her story, let's look at what came next. Their temple was closed, the fire was extinguished. In the refectory, meals were prepared daily. Bread was baked, tea boiled, firewood stacked, and in the middle of all this unspoken, unnamed was the hearth. Not every deity requires thunderbolts or serpents or revenge plots. Some powers endure by being useful, not flashy, that tending to the small things, feeding the fire, boiling the water, sweeping the floors, just as worthy of reverence as conquering cities or crafting thunderbolts. Their emotions are loud, their decisions impulsive, their stories filled with vengeance, betrayal, and spectacle. She teaches that maintenance is not dull, it is holy, no longer sacred in title, but sacred in practice. The Vestal Virgins, Rome's last great guardians of Hestia's Roman counterpart, were disbanded in the late 4th century CE, when Christianity became the state religion. This might seem like the end, a quiet puff of smoke as the flame disappeared, that stirred the soup, fold the linen, and light the way home. The hearth became the altar. Candles flickered beside sacred images. Meals shared around the table became acts of fellowship. It was the line that separated wilderness from warmth. To keep the hearth lit was to keep the world in order, not because it was dramatic, but because it was dependable. Women continued to maintain the fire, not as priestesses, but as mothers, grandmothers, and caretakers of the home. But again, perhaps not. In many ways, the rise of Christianity absorbed much of Hestia's symbolic ground. Instead, she stayed at the center and held the space. She made sure there was somewhere to return to after the quest, after the feast, after the flood. Above it, a simple chimney or just a smoke hole. Around it, stories were told, food was cooked, and families stayed warm through long winters. We gather in kitchens during parties, even when the rest of the house is beautifully furnished. The hearth is not dead, it simply changed shape. It moved from marble temples to cast iron stoves, from civic altars to quiet rituals. It was the heart of the home, not unlike the Prytaneum of old. Monasteries, particularly in early Christian Europe, preserved Hestia's spirit. These communities were centered around kitchens and warmth, and consider the medieval cottage, at its center, a hearth. Even today, the idea persists. We say hearth and home to mean comfort. We light candles for peace. So, in the grand sweep of history, what can we learn from Hestia? Not every force needs to dominate the narrative. Hestia reminds us that stability can be sacred. In the mythology of Olympus, gods often reflect the best and worst parts of humanity. But Hestia, she reflects something else, something gentler. She reflects the parts of us that care, that stay, that wait by the door, and that's where her real power lies. For centuries, her sacred fire marked the boundary between chaos and civilization, and perhaps that's what makes her the most quietly radical of the Olympians. She never waged war, she never claimed a lover, she never stormed across the sky. So if we're being honest, maybe it was Hestia, not Zeus, who kept Olympus running all along. And in the quiet spaces of your own life, the warm corners, the familiar sounds, the soft, repetitive rituals of daily existence, you might feel a flicker of her presence too. You might feel her in the glow of your reading lamp, in the rhythm of boiling water, in the hush that settles just before sleep. And if you do, just know she never needed a temple. She only ever needed a place to stay. You might imagine the Greek underworld as dark, chaotic, and filled with writhing souls and wailing spirits. But if you were to find yourself standing before its gates after crossing the river Styx, of course you'd be in for a surprise. Because, as it turns out, Hades ran a very tight ship. A carefully managed, somewhat gloomy civil service office, complete with sorting procedures, strict border policies, and a staff of minor deities who never took lunch breaks. The Greek underworld wasn't just a shadowy pit where the dead wandered aimlessly. No, it was more like what it was Hades himself, not to be confused with the place. Hades the god was not particularly evil. He didn't relish in death. He didn't punish souls. He didn't drag people to the underworld. His job, and he took it very seriously, was simple: make sure everything stayed in its proper place. And that's exactly what he did. No, first, you had to find your way to the banks of the river Styx, or the Acheron, depending on which myth you rereading. There, you'd meet Charon, the famously grouchy boatman. Let's start with your arrival. Once your soul left your body, you didn't just meander into the afterlife. Now, Charon didn't take just anyone. You had to present your fare, usually a coin placed in your mouth or on your eyes during burial. A peaceful, sunlit meadow where you could enjoy a restful eternity, possibly with lyres and light refreshments. Not bad, not great, a bit foggy, a bit bland. Think of it as a bureaucratic waiting room that never ended. Most people ended up here. If you arrived without payment, you'd be stuck wandering the shores for a century. No exceptions. Bureaucracy waits for no ghost. Like being eternally thirsty while standing in water you couldn't drink, or rolling a boulder uphill forever. Assuming you had your coin and Charon ferried you across, your next stop was the entrance to the underworld, guarded by a very large, very loyal, three-headed dog, Cerberus. Tantalus, who tried to feed his son to the gods. Sisyphus, who cheated death twice. Ixion, who made entirely inappropriate advances toward Hera. Cerberus didn't let the living in, and more importantly, he didn't let the dead out. Think of him as the underworld's very fluffy, very effective doorman. And ascend to the Isles of the Blessed, kind of deluxe retirement plan for the virtuous, drifting through their designated zones, forever stamped and sorted by Hades' divine system. They didn't shout or wave scrolls. They listened, they deliberated, and they assigned you a residence based on your earthly behavior. So many titles, all working like a quiet, eternal government agency. The dead often drank from the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. The idea was that, by forgetting their past lives, souls could settle into eternity more peacefully. He wasn't cruel. He didn't chase mortals with scythes or punish them without cause. He upheld balance. He followed the rules. He made sure the dead stayed put and the living understood the consequences of crossing lines. Once you passed him, your journey into Hades' realm truly began. But here's where things get even more structured. Upon arrival, souls were sent to be judged by a panel of 3 former kings, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iolcus, and just how stubbornly the god of the underworld upheld his order. There were a few options. If you'd lived a life of true virtue, heroism, justice, great sacrifice, you were sent to the Elysian fields. If you'd been moderately decent, neither a saint nor a scoundrel, you ended up in the Asphodel Meadows, a neutral zone. Hermes, in his role as psychopomp, guided souls to their destinations. You've handed in your paperwork, you've been stamped, you've been sorted. Thanatos, the personification of death, handled the logistics of dying itself. Nyx, the night, kept everything appropriately dim. And if you'd committed serious crimes or offended the gods, you were sent to Tartarus. But Tartarus wasn't for just anyone, only the truly wicked or those who crossed divine lines ended up here. Their punishments were specific, ironic, and oddly poetic. But those punishments were reserved for the famous few. Most souls didn't get punished, they just stayed, a bit faded, a bit forgetful. In fact, memory was something Hades' realm handled quite deliberately. Unless, of course, you opted into the special reincarnation program. Yes, there was one. According to later traditions, if a soul had achieved Elysium 3 times, it could choose to leave the cycle of rebirth altogether. But if you wanted to return to life earlier, you had to drink from Lethe to forget everything. Reincarnation without baggage, you might say. And then there were the administrative assistants of the underworld. Hecate, goddess of magic and ghosts, often flitted around the borderlands. So many roles. It wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient. And that's the part most people miss about Hades. In a world where gods regularly turned into swans, bulls, or golden rain, Hades remained stubbornly consistent. Of course, there were exceptions. There were always exceptions. Orpheus, Heracles, Persephone. But each of those cases, dramatic as they may seem, only served to highlight just how rare it was to bend the rules of Hades' system. But those stories will come in time. For now, you're standing in a foggy administrative hallway, metaphorically speaking, and now you wait, quietly, like millions before you, all under the calm and watchful gaze of Hades, the most overqualified manager in ancient mythology. Now, having passed through the structured entrance to the underworld, having paid your fare, faced judgment, and been sorted into your eternal residence, you might think the story of Hades' domain ends there. But every well-run bureaucracy faces its share of complications. And in the underworld of Greek mythology, the complications often came in the form of living people trying to break in, which, when you think about it, is a very unusual problem to have. In this section, we'll explore 3 such interruptions each, one famous in its own right, teach, one forcing the god, Hades, to deal with that most dreaded of administrative headaches, exceptions to the rules. Let's begin with Heracles, the original rule-bender. His 12 labors are the stuff of legend, and one of them took him somewhere mortals weren't meant to go. Heracles, better known by his Roman name, Hercules, was no ordinary mortal. Son of Zeus, blessed with strength, cursed with tragic tasks. Labor number 12. Bring Cerberus, the 3-headed dog of the underworld, back to the land of the living. Now, to be clear, this wasn't supposed to be forever, just a brief loan. So Heracles, with all the subtlety of a demigod, marched straight into the underworld. Some say he was guided by Hermes, others by Athena. Either way, he was one of the few mortals allowed in without dying first. When he arrived, he didn't try to sneak past Hades. No, Heracles approached the god directly. And what did Hades do? He simply asked for one thing, that Heracles take Cerberus without using weapons and without harming the dog. He didn't rage, he didn't curse, he didn't throw Heracles into Tartarus. Think about that. The dog snarled, barked, and terrified an entire Greek village. The Lord of the Dead was willing to part with his guard dog temporarily as long as Heracles followed the rules. When his beloved Eurydice died suddenly from a snakebite, he refused to accept the judgment of fate. Heracles agreed, wrestled Cerberus into submission using only his bare hands, and brought him back up to the surface. Then, as promised, Heracles returned him. He pleaded, he played, and everyone listened, even Hades. The system, although shaken, had survived. Hades, true to form, had remained calm, composed, and firmly in control. A clear policy, no fine print, just trust. Now let's consider a more delicate situation. Orpheus and Eurydice. When the rule was broken, the deal was void. Orpheus, the poet-musician, could charm stones and trees with his lyre. And so he made the journey no bard had ever made before into Hades' realm with nothing but his song. Unlike Heracles, Orpheus didn't burst in. Even Persephone, according to some traditions, Hades wept. So moved were the rulers of the underworld that they granted Orpheus an unprecedented offer. He could take Eurydice back with him. But, and this is important, there was a condition. Withheld the rain, refused to let anything grow. He must not look back at her until they both had reached the world of the living. It was a simple rule, no second chances, no angry shouting from the god of the underworld, just quiet finality. Orpheus almost made it, but right at the edge, with sunlight streaming ahead, he turned, perhaps to check, perhaps to reassure, perhaps out of fear, and with that she vanished, drawn back into the mist forever. Again, Hades upheld his end. He made an exception, but not without conditions. A diplomatic envoy to Hades to negotiate the girl's return, no appeals. And that brings us to the most famous resident of Hades' bureaucracy, Persephone. And each one reveals something about how Hades operated. Unlike Heracles and Orpheus, Persephone didn't enter the underworld by choice. She was taken, abducted, depending on the version, while picking flowers on the surface. Hades saw her, fell in love, and opened up a chasm in the earth itself to bring her down to his kingdom. This was no small disturbance to the balance of life and death. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and when Demeter found her daughter missing, the world changed. She stopped the crops, humans began to starve, ensuring that, while the living may stray, the dead stayed where they belonged. Zeus, seeing the mess unfold, sent Hermes as an emissary. Hades agreed, but he had a rule of his own. If Persephone had eaten anything in the underworld, she would be bound to it, and she had a few seeds of a pomegranate, enough to anchor her soul in his realm. The compromise was bureaucratic perfection. Persephone would spend part of the year in the underworld with Hades, and part of the year on earth with her mother. 6 months down, 6 months up, and so the seasons were born. When Persephone descends, Demeter mourns winter. When she returns, Demeter rejoices spring. Even love and loss were codified into a system. Even nature obeyed the rhythm of Hades' decisions. Each of these intrusions, Heracles' mission, Orpheus' plea, Persephone's capture, tested the boundaries of the underworld's rules. He wasn't impulsive like Zeus. He wasn't wrathful like Poseidon. He didn't make exceptions without consequence. But he could be reasoned with. He could be moved, sometimes. And above all, he respected the delicate balance between life and death. That balance, of course, would continue to be tested in myths and legends for centuries. But beneath it all, Hades remained steady, guarding his realm, upholding his rules. The real question, though, is this: why did the ancient Greeks build such an orderly vision of the afterlife in the first place? If you've ever waited in line at a government office, you know the feeling, the slow crawl of procedure, the hum of quiet resignation, the low flicker of fluorescent lighting. Now imagine that, forever, but with rivers made of fire, forgetfulness, and wailing souls in the background. And yet even in the underworld of Greek mythology, there was order. And in this final section of our exploration of Hades' surprisingly well-run dominion, we'll take a sleepy walk through its more bureaucratic features. This wasn't a chaotic pit of random punishment. No, the Greek afterlife resembled something closer to a carefully filed system of posthumous administration. If a deity swore by the Styx and broke their word, they'd lose their voice for 9 years. A built-in consequence, like getting your heavenly license suspended. Let's begin with the rivers. There were 5 main rivers in the underworld, and no, they weren't just spooky metaphors. Each had a specific purpose, a kind of function in the mythological workflow of the dead. They were like routing paths in a grand mythological database, streams along which souls were sorted, processed, and filed. Some say it looped around Tartarus, perhaps as a protective barrier or deterrent, much like barbed wire. Styx, the river of oaths, even the gods feared it. Once the king of Crete, now king of careful judgment, a sort of intake channel, like the grim version of a front desk. Not just a nice symbolic gesture, served as a kind of data reset. The past cleared, the slate wiped clean. Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. Souls destined for reincarnation would drink from it and forget their previous lives, like administrators cross-checking ledgers. Acheron, the river of pain. It was the first you'd meet, ferried across by Charon. Down you'd go, to Tartarus, where punishments were customized and generally unpleasant. Their fates were tailored, logical in a certain poetic way. For that, he was made to stand forever in water he could never drink, beneath fruit he could never reach. A punishment that matched the crime he offered hunger to the gods. So he was given eternal hunger. Souls would line up, choose new lives, like picking tickets, and drink from the river, Lethe, to forget the old one. Like a queue at the celestial DMV, choose your form, stamp your fate, move along. Phlegethon, a river of fire, not quite hellish, but certainly unpleasant. Pushing a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down forever. Their world wasn't governed by randomness, but by fate, order, and justice. Every choice had a weight. Every action a counterweight. He was feared because he was unwavering. He didn't make impulsive decisions. He didn't break his own rules. And once a soul entered his realm, it was bound by the terms of the agreement. A perfect metaphor for eternal futility. It wasn't just cruel, it was tidy, systematic, elegant, in a mythological sort of way. Cocytus, the river of wailing. Not the sort of thing you'd want piped into your waiting room, but fitting for a place of eternal lamentation. Together, these rivers weren't just features of a gloomy map. It was designed to reflect reality as a slow, complex, slightly gloomy, but ultimately ordered system. And the filing didn't stop there. Enter the judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iolcus. 3 stern-faced arbiters of the afterlife, each with jurisdiction over different kinds of souls. Minos, the final vote, a tiebreaker, a voice of seniority. Rhadamanthus, the strict enforcer, often associated with judging souls from the east. Iolcus, sometimes said to hold the keys to Hades itself, ruling over those from Europe. They didn't shout or doom or thunder. Instead, they weighed a person's life, quietly, efficiently. Did you live well? Off to the Elysian fields you'd go, fields of sunlight, poetry, and peaceful rest. Live a neutral life. Perhaps the asphodel meadows, not unpleasant, just forgettable. A spiritual waiting room without an exit. Live cruelly or impiously. Speaking of punishment, it's worth remembering that even the worst offenders, titans, oathbreakers, and braggart kings weren't punished randomly. Take Tantalus, for example. He killed his own son, served him to the gods, and stole ambrosia. Or Sisyphus, the clever king who cheated death, twice his punishment. Even reincarnation, as Plato imagined in his dialogue The Myth of Er, had a process. Now, you may be wondering, why did the ancient Greeks imagine all this? Why construct such a detailed, rule-based, administrative version of death? The answer may lie in something quite boring and profoundly human. The Greeks believed in balance, not just in life, but in the afterlife too. The underworld reflected that. In many ways, Hades wasn't feared because he was monstrous. And that's what makes the Greek underworld different from later visions of hell and paradise. It wasn't designed to reward or torment in extremes. A place where your life was evaluated, sorted, and sealed. Where eternal forms were processed like parchment in a very old office. Where even gods had to follow procedure. And maybe that's why Hades himself, despite ruling the land of the dead, was never considered evil. Grim, yes. Strict, absolutely. But evil, no. He just ran the system, and he ran it well. So the next time you find yourself in line at a bank, or dealing with yet another round of official documents, consider this. The Greeks imagined the afterlife the same way, not as chaos, but as something boring, predictable, maybe even strangely comforting. Because for them, the real fear wasn't the fire or the wailing, it was disorder. And in Hades' underworld, disorder simply wasn't allowed.